Thanks, Ramel. Tom, it's absolutely an honor and privilege for me to be talking to you this morning about your very good friend, a very influential Canadian businessman, a passionate Canadian, the late Jack Lawrence. But before we talk about Jack, I thought we would just take 1 minute or a couple of minutes here. Tom, I wanted to actually recognize you. As most of you know, Tom, after hearing that overview about Tom, has been involved in many different things in Canadian life. He's been in politics, he's been in the business, he's been, as they say, he's been the ambassador of the business community. Tom, you've had this illustrious career and you've contributed in so many ways, and I just wanted to say a big thank you to you for being such a passionate Canadian and for your public service. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So now, in case some of you don't know Tom that well enough, Tom's actually spent part of his pandemic also writing a book. And it's quite a masterpiece. So not to affect Stephen Poles' sales, we've kind of made sure that this kind of gets a bit lagged. So Tom's written this book called Private Power and Public Purse, which is going to come out in February. So look out for that. From what I've heard, it's a terrific read. And you'll get to learn not only about Tom, but in the many ways in which he contributed to Canada. So Tom, we're all looking forward to that. And one of the things you have in that book is you talk about your journey with Jack. And now, I suspect there are very few people in this room that actually met Jack. Certainly I didn't get a chance. I've only read through the Lawrence Center minutes, and so that's how I know Jack. And I suspect a few people even probably Googled this morning and said, you know, who is Jack Lawrence? The Toronto Star in 2009 described him as in the following way: the Bay Street luminary known for his intensity in both the boardroom and the gym. So Tom, I wonder if you could just take a few minutes and tell us a little bit about Jack. Tell us a little bit like what he was like and his character. So.
Delighted, Mahmoud. But first of all, let me say what a great pleasure it is to be here today, and a salute to the great Ivy School, the good work that the Dean is doing, the good work that the Lawrence Center is doing. And Rommel, very much appreciative of all the work you're doing, and the advisory board, of course, chaired by none other than Stephen Poles, who this morning explained to us in splendid clarity what the real tectonic shifts are all about. And incidentally, thanks for the shout out on the book. I should tell you that one of the people who actually read the whole thing, all 500 pages, was none other than Stephen Poles, and he even chose to endorse it. I hope he doesn't come to regret that. Anyway, look, about Jack. Jack was really quite an incredible guy. On August the 3rd, in 2009, I was just about to get on an airplane here in Ottawa to make my way to Toronto, where I always spend a great deal of time. And Jack and I were to have lunch at the Toronto Club that day at 12:30. And as I was getting on my plane, I got an urgent call from my office saying that Jack, who was at the controls of his Cessna that morning with a companion, had tried to lift off the lake on his float plane, and he didn't make it. And the plane hit the ridge, and very, very sadly, he was killed. So it was really quite a blow to me. And the extraordinary thing is, he died at age 75, and here was a man who was a health freak. Never touched any sweets, salts were banned. And he always used to say to me, I plan to live to 100 for sure, maybe even 110. So we lost him in his, at least in his mind, his youth. And if he'd been around, he would have made many more contributions. Jack was born, I suppose, what you might call a Depression child. He was born in 1934. So while he did not personally see the hardships of the Depression, He grew up in a family who had had some exposure to the Depression, and those stories always stuck with him. He lived in a variety of places, Winnipeg, Montreal, Hamilton, and then finally settled in Toronto. And of course, he was a graduate of Western. He was always very, very proud of his association with Western and always spoke very highly of Ivy. And as somebody who went to Queen's and UBC and a few other institutions and never having studied at Ivy, it was Jack who first put it into my mind that I should be paying attention to Ivy. And that's really how that first connection took place. Jack was really quite a business pioneer as well. Before I met him, I think about a week before I met him, somebody said, the man you're about to meet has the best nose when it comes to bonds on Bay Street. He actually did become a leading bond expert. He created a boutique company, Burns Fry. And at the time that he was running it, it was worth, I know it all sounds piddling today, about $10 million, and he sold it to the Bank of Montreal for about $450 million, which was really, I suppose, his first big step forward as an entrepreneur, and that then became merged into Nesbitt Burns, and then finally he set up Lawrence and Company. I know quite a bit about Lawrence and Company because I was an investor in it, and I can tell you he certainly contributed in a reasonably important way, relatively speaking, to certainly the increase in my net wealth. And if he were here today, he would love what he had heard in the first couple of panels, because Lawrence and Company was really an investor in technology firms and in healthcare. So that's a bit about Jack, the person, a wee bit about his business career.
Thanks, Tom. You know, a man who could stay away from sweets, you know, that's great discipline. But indeed, and a sad note that we lost him way too early. Now, Jack had a particular passion about public policy and an interest in public policy. Talk to me a little bit about some of the things that sparked his interest in public policy, some of the files that you worked on. I think you mentioned to me about some deep discussions you had about free trade.
Right. Well, Jack is an example of, I wouldn't say hugely rare, but somewhat exceptional in the sense that it was a hard-driven entrepreneur. You know, he worked around the clock. So you say to yourself, how does a person like that find the time to think about, care about public policy? But extraordinarily, he did. And those in the room, and Steve and all of you who've been involved in the evolution of fiscal policy in this country will know that we had some near-death experiences. And in the early 1990s, when we were on the brink of the IMF having to walk in and read the Riot Act to us because our debt to GDP ratios were soaring, our deficits were exploding, nobody seemed to care. Through the auspices of the Business Council, which I was heading at the time, we were pretty fierce deficit fighters. And I asked for volunteers as to who would join me on a cross-Canada tour to fight the deficit. And we were using a new technology at the time called PowerPoint. So we put together these PowerPoint presentations that demonstrated that the heavens were about to fall. And we quite literally went from Halifax to Vancouver. And that was probably a total of maybe 15 days worth, maybe 18 days worth of Jack's time and mine and a few other people who were part of this brigade. And we scared the hell out of people. And at the same time made very, very strong representations to the then recently elected Chrétien government and to the new Minister of Finance, who chose in his first budget largely to ignore this issue. And then things got really, really bad. And in his second budget, he declared come hell or high water. And the rest, as you know, is history. So Jack made the time to do that, which is, you know, when you're running a business where you have to really have your nose to the wheel, it demonstrates. Secondly, he was always...
So, Tom, I think I actually remember that PowerPoint slide, because I think for some of you, the Globe and Mail on the front cover had a loonie, and it was basically split in half.
Right.
And I think half of it was going to our debt servicing costs, and half of it was going to pay for our programs.
Well, in fact, even more than that, arithmetically. So it was very, very worrisome at the time. He also had a strong interest in competitiveness. That's why, what the Lawrence Center is doing and what Ivy more broadly is doing and what the Dean spoke to this morning, to him, competitiveness was the thing. Productivity was a word that you were never allowed to use in those days. If labor heard the word productivity, they would come down on you like. But competitiveness was very important to him, and he participated in a very important exercise. So at this time when things were looking pretty grim in Canada, and we were way down the list in terms of comparative competitiveness, I reached out to Professor Michael Porter at Harvard. Porter had done, you may remember, a study of a number of countries, I think 11 if I remember correctly, a comparative study, which formed the basis of his book on the competitive advantage of nations. And when I phoned up Michael, I said, would you add Canada to that exercise? And he said, yes, I'd be pleased to do so. And we launched a one-year exercise that had a Porter team and our team. And our team, our CEO team, was chaired by Jack. And once a month, we would meet for a full day, once a month. And we did so for one whole year to talk about how we were going to address the great competitive challenges of Canada. And again, he was prepared to put his time into that. And when we published our report, some of you, because we live in the internet age now, where you can reach literally millions of people in no time. But at that particular time, when we published our report, and we made, it was not an error, it was intentional on my part, but when it was written up in the Globe and Mail after we launched it with Porter, we said any Canadian interested in this study, just call this number, which was our BCNI number at the time. And we ended up sending 18,000 copies of that report. That's how much appetite there was for this issue. So Jack played a key role there. FTA, I've spoken to you, Mahmoud, and to Rommel. There's an historic picture taken here at the Chateau Laurier, sitting down with Vice President George H.W. Bush at the time, where it was 1983, a couple of years before the launch of the Shamrock Summit and the Great Free Trade Initiative, in which my good friend Don Campbell played a key role. And at the table is Jack Lawrence, along with about 8 or 9 of us, where we put a proposition to the Vice President and said, wouldn't it be a great idea if we had a free trade agreement with your country? And his response was, well, what would be in it for the United States of America? And the answer was, I gave, an economy the size of California. And sitting next to him was Martin Feldstein, who's still alive, and those of you who are great economists would know. And the Vice President turned to him and said, Marty, I think we should take a good hard look at this. Only to say that Jack was at the table, very enthusiastic about free trade. There are other examples. He fought the good fight on GST. But one of his overall concerns was complacency. He always felt we've got to do more. You know, we might make some headway on the deficit. We might be going great guns on free trade, but that's never enough. We've got to do more. So those are some of the areas in which Jack was involved.
Great, Tom. And I'm sure innovation and human capital were part of that discussion too, weren't they?
Exactly.
So, Tom, at the heart of the issue of competitiveness, which was a real big concern for Jack, was this the business-government relationship.
Right.
And from reading just the documents, one got the sense that he was very, very concerned about the nature of that relationship. And I think one of the quotes was something along the lines that government decision makers don't understand business leaders, and business leaders don't understand government decision makers.
Right.
So, how did Jack become so seized by that issue of business-government relationship?
Well, early on, he'd had some experience as a member of the council during the government of Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And
Whom you served under.
Who I served under. And in those days, I mean, people complain now that the government is tone deaf. They're not listening. If Perrin Beatty, as the head of our largest business association, would have very strong views on this. But it's hard to get through to this particular government. But in the days of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the philosopher king, there was very little time to talk to business. The mechanisms that we know now of consultation just simply did not exist. And when I was on the staff, the idea of a meeting with business was to call up a few people the night before, don't tell them what was on the agenda, invite them to come to Ottawa, and then beat the hell out of them and send them home. That was how business government relations were run in that time. And Jack had some awareness of that. But as we moved into subsequent governments, there was always a problem. Some governments were more receptive than others. I'm speaking here federally, and one can look at provincial governments as well. But he believed that business had to be taken more seriously. And that meant that any work that we did had to be well researched. You know, it wasn't just a gang of people with all sorts of different ideas walking into a room in an uncoordinated way. So the idea of preparing yourself. Secondly, that we did evidence-based analysis that would empower us to go into a meeting and very often, perhaps no more than certainly than the politicians knew about the subject matter, convey it in a respectful way, but at the same time forcefully. He also believed and knew the importance of working with senior public servants. A little less so today because the current government doesn't pay that much attention to senior public servants, sadly. I know that's a whole other issue. But it was always our view, and certainly it went to the heart of what we did in the council, the Business Council, that to work very, very closely with the senior levels of the public service, because politicians could come and go, public servants would be there. So the issue of continuity. And Jack also believed that you always had to think of the long term. The tendency of business then, and sadly even it exists today, is you're in and out. You're busy, everybody's busy, you're running a major enterprise. We just heard in the last panel the importance of a 20-year vision. And I'm a great believer in visions, a lot of people are not, that they can be helpful. But when you're in a situation where agendas are being determined by what you read on the paper this morning, or being driven by very short-term considerations, it was vital that business be able to tackle an issue and stick with it and be tenacious. And the tenacity meant that you also had to be very good at advocacy. And advocacy meant you just don't advocate for 3 months, 6 months, or a year. You have to be prepared to advocate for many, many months. The case of the Free Trade Agreement, when we started working on it in the Business Council in the early 80s, that was a 10-year commitment, and then went right into NAFTA. You can say it was a 15-year commitment. Those things are really, really important. And then I said, but the last thing was that he believed that the business schools should be able to play a critical role. And that's what really motivated him to say, here's something that Ivy could do and do very, very well. After all, it's a blue ribbon a business school. It's preparing leaders for the future. Why not do something at Ivy?
Great, Tom. So I think in our final panel, I'm sure Perrin and Peter are going to have a view or two about how consultation happens today and whether, in fact, these are just mechanical exercises or, in fact, whether somebody's actually listening or not. So if Jack was around today, what would Jack say? Have we actually moved the needle on the government-business relationship? I get the sense from you, based on your views, that you might think that we've kind of regressed a bit.
Well, you know, Mahmoud, I sort of hate to say this because I know you asked me to think about this. If he were here this morning, what would he be saying? Well, he would certainly share many of the frustrations that we heard from the two excellent panels that we heard this morning about we've got a lot of good ideas. You know, translating the ideas into action is really tough. There are many impediments that stand in the way. And I would say he would be disappointed. Why? Well, you know, he was very much a deficit hawk. He was a believer that whatever is said and done, that if a government does not stand on solid, rock-hard fiscal principles, the kind of things that my friend Stephen Pulitz talks about, you're going to be in very serious trouble. And I'm not saying that he would reject a great deal of the very logical expenditure that had to be done during COVID, but he would also be looking at, he would consider some of the easy way in which he had a way of saying that when governments were not paying attention, they would just simply continue to write checks. I think he would condemn some of that, what I would call excessive check writing that we have seen. I think a second thing he would say is that we've not really been very good at advancing this competitiveness agenda, that it does require a long-term commitment. It requires working very, very hard together with all the stakeholders. And, you know, I think it was Paul Wells who made the point that and Heather Schofield, when she was saying we've had so many studies, going way back to Porter, but government studies, the Tom Jenkins studies, time and time again, we've had studies. Peter Harder did some good work at the Senate. And every 3 or 4 or 5 years, we come back to where we started. And I have to say that, and this is reflected in my book, the epilogue in my book laments that we're not very good at building great things anymore. You know, we did great things in the post-World War period. Now we have a German chancellor that comes to Canada and says, we want your energy, but we don't have an infrastructure to deliver it. And we have a prime minister who says, no one's made the business case. I rest my case on that particular one. So he would be disappointed that we've somehow lost that ability to say, let's think big and create big things and really make them happen. He had an expression that was borrowed from one of my good friends from Calgary. He loved that I gave him once, and then he used it. And he said, you know, too often we're a nation of all hat and no cattle. You know, that's a great Western expression. And he would say, if he were sitting on this podium this morning, he'd say, I'm sorry to say, despite the excellent work of Ivy and the work of so many leaders in this room, it's still a little too much of hat and not enough of cattle. So I don't think he'd be very happy. He'd be impatient, but he would say, I said then, and I repeat now, complacency is deadly. Because even in 2001, after we had turned Canada in record time, according to The Economist, from being the worst fiscally in the G7 to being the most virtuous of the G7, after we'd put in place the free trade agreement, after we'd put in place the GST, we were running surpluses. He still said then, this is not enough. Complacency will kill us unless we keep on going. So bottom line, he wouldn't be a terribly happy camper, but he would certainly be happy with the agenda that you people have put together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. That's very, very kind. So, Tom, you know, you've been so kind enough to share that history about Jack, and it would be kind of fascinating to have Stephen Pulitz and Jack Lawrence, right, have a conversation on stage about deficits, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, I can't let you leave stage without one final question. So, Tom, you've had this incredible career. You've played such a significant role in all different parts. What do you tell leaders today? Accomplished leaders, emerging leaders. What's that 1 or 2 pieces of advice that you would give to them about how we improve competitiveness, how we make Canada a better place? Now, I don't want to steal the thunder from your book, but what's your advice to this generation of leaders and the next generation of leaders?
Well, this is a naked, ruthless, audacious plug for my book.
Uh-oh.
But if you read 501 pages of it, you'll find you know, a lot of answers in there. But I would say this very simply, specifically on what drove Jack to donate $4.9 million to establish Lawrence. Incidentally, also supported by additional grants, including by the Great Power Corporation of Canada, represented today here by my good friend Paul Genet. He would say on the business-government relationship, he would say, really, really be serious about the homework you do. Devote the time. Make sure that he believed in the power of ideas, yes, but that you really had to back it up with good, really solid analysis, so that when you walk through the door and you're dealing with government, they will respect what you have to say. And if one government has supplanted another one and they're totally new to it, they'll say, my goodness, haven't you done a lot of good homework? And we should be paying close attention. That's number one. Number two, he would say to business, forget this short-termism. You have to put your shoulder to the wheel, devote the time, create the task forces, be in there for the long term, because this is not a short-term business. And the third thing he would say is don't be intimidated about advocacy. One of my concerns now, I mean, people like Perrin Beatty are engaged in advocacy 24 hours a day and doing a phenomenal job. He just came back from Bali, where he was, and you're looking remarkably well, my friend, for having flown across the Pacific. But people like Perrin and my successor a couple of times over, and Goldie Hyder and others, Flavio and the extraordinary work he's doing, are really engaged in effective advocacy, but we've got to be absolutely fearless. There's a tendency now to say, well, you know, this government's a little bit tone deaf. They don't really like business that much, I would say. But don't let that stop you. You just have to continue. And if it means the business is not listening to you, you have to do what my father always used to say. If they won't let you in through the front door, you go through the back door. If the back door is locked, you come down through the chimney. But you have to get in. You have to stick to it, and the constituency you are trying to influence, if governments are not listening, is that broader constituency out there. That's what we did with free trade. That's what we did with the GST. That's what we did to some extent with competitiveness. That's what that poor, bedraggled sector called agriculture, oil and gas, minerals and natural resources are trying to do, which is a source of huge wealth to this country, but which these people pay very little attention to. You have to go over and beyond the governments. And to do that, you will have scars, you will be criticized, they won't let you in the door, but don't let that worry you, because the end game is a much bigger game than just trying to influence 30 people around the cabinet table.
Well, Tom, this has been absolutely terrific.
Thank
you for the stories. Thank you for the advice, the insights. What a pleasure it's been.
Great,
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.